Morning all. As many of you know, I do a chess-based lecture on Tuesday nights, and yesterday, last night's lecture was quite interesting. I went over one of the rapid play games which I showed you in a previous video, avoiding the brilliancy prize. But there were two games I went over from the perspective of hanging pawns, which I thought might be interesting for those viewers to revise that lecture last night, but and also for you guys at YouTube to share the insights. If you're not already a friend of mine on Facebook, the two games actually came up when I was recommending some Master Collection games. So I'm on Facebook.com/KingsCrusher. If you want to send a friend request, you'll see that I'm kibitzing more and more about puzzles and master games in general. So yeah, friend me on Facebook and you can get ahead of stuff which I might be presenting. So here goes. This was Topalov playing against Kasparov in a rapid match in 1998, and I thought it was kind of elegantly played by Kasparov, so we'll see why. Knight f3, d5. The hanging pawns, once we get to the hanging pawns, I'll describe really their properties, and they can emerge from this particular variation, which was like the Queen's Gambit declined, like Tartakower variation. Statistically, they're likely to emerge from this, but they can emerge from other openings, of course, and in reverse. So what do we mean by hanging pawns? Well, I'm about to show you what they are. There's one pawn here, and note there's no adjacent pawn here for black. So this pawn's potentially isolated if there wasn't a pawn here. It's going to have a friendly pawn next to it now after c5, but white is delaying taking for the moment. a6, and now we see it. We see the hanging pawns. So what is it about them, and why are they similar to isolated pawns? What do they share in common as general properties? Well, like the isolated pawn, there's dynamic properties, because the isolated pawn, which doesn't have anything either side, at least supports e4 and c4 for a knight outpost, and sometimes frees black's pieces. If this diagonal, f2 is often weaker, and this file, so it's cleared away some of the lines for pressure. Sometimes an isolated pawn. Hanging pawn, slightly similar properties in that it's potentially structurally weak to have these two pawns without any pawn like here on that side or this side. So they are kind of a ×2 version of an isolated pawn, really, hanging pawns. So the strengths, it offers d4 as a possibility, a dynamic possibility all the time, which could have implications for a kingside attack, or just generally increasing the scope of pieces, especially this guy. So there's dynamic potential afforded by them if they can move forward at any time with great effect. Now, if they're blockaded, if they're fixed, say this pawn went to c4, then white would get a very nice blockade square. So the problem with them is them becoming fixed, and also this c5 is often the target as well on the c file, because they've got no pawns on either side to protect them. There's no pawn on b6, there's no pawn on e6, so potentially they suffer structurally like an isolated pawn. So basically it all depends on the position, if you can play with them with great effect or not. So we'll see two different examples. Now, in this first example game, we'll be on the plus sides of the hanging pawns. So how did Kasparov liberate them? How did he prepare for d4? Why was it so effective? Remember, though, it was only a rapid game, but I still thought it was kind of neat. So rook f d1, and look at white's pieces. They seem to be well coordinated. The energy is flowing in all of them. There's no bad piece. The rooks seem logically placed to attack both pawns. It seems, though, that Kasparov was able to fend off pressure here. Maybe you could argue this queen, is it really ideally placed on a4 in this particular position? It's putting a bit of pressure on the queen side, though. Maybe it's tying down the rook in certain circumstances. So a6. Maybe this is annoying, this pressure on d7. Generally, it looks as though black is under great pressure here, if you look at this position, and that white, at this moment, at move 14, doesn't have any major issues. So would you like to play this position with the hanging pawns here? Well, okay, Kasparov's next move seems quite logical and almost as if it's one of the only decent moves available, in fact. With such pressure on his position, with white having the option of bishop f6s and knight d5s if black's not careful, can't easily like move this knight or this bishop, even because there's a pin if he moves the bishop. Can't move this bishop, can't really move this rook without a6 becoming potentially vulnerable. Not here maybe, because there might be rook a8 back, you know, bishop a6 and rook a8. But there's a lot of pressure obviously. But this next move seems to be logically related to black's liberating possibility of playing d4. Kasparov plays queen b6, so we can see this might be handy for d4s later. And also it's putting some pressure on b2. Now this next move by Toplov, he doesn't mind damaging his own pawns a bit to try and make the hanging pawns more of an exploitable weakness. He plays actually queen b3. So if the pawns get doubled here, maybe this is fine for white because of knight a4. Hitting c5, it's more towards an endgame, so any liberating d4 is not going to be with so much power with the queens on for white's king safety. Also maybe, you know, the a file might be useful for a6. So anyway, Kasparov rejected the idea of queen takes b3 here. I'll give you a moment to check this position. Hold on a sec. Okay, now what Kasparov did here looks like a bit of a cheeky move. A frightened rabbit move maybe, queen a7, but I don't think it is, because strategically he's still aiming for d4 quite logically, and there's no specific refutation available to black's position on the hanging pawns at the moment. I hope you'd agree. I don't want to turn on an engine to check that, by the way. So bishop g3, and it looks as though, yes, again, white's position looks very pleasant at the moment, even at move 16. All the pieces, you know, seem to be nice, and these hanging pawns are nicely restrained. So this next move, rook a d8, again, it's almost as if d4 is on the cards, seriously on the cards. Rook d2, now rook f e8. So not wanting to create any particular battery of two rooks, just content with maybe bishop f8 and d4 to get e-file pressure later, if d4 is going to be played. Queen d1, really putting the brakes on d4 maybe. Double battery against d4. Bishop f8. Again, the hanging pawns, theoretically, they might be vulnerable. Here, prove it. Black, even with the awkward-looking queen on a7, the queen is coming to a very useful diagonal, though. Although it can hardly be called central on a8, it does have central implications from there across the diagonal, and to create this battery with this bishop for d4 to be more effective in this particular configuration with these hanging pawns. Okay, so bishop h4, and now queen a8. And of course you can play this in reverse. If you had hanging pawns as white in reverse, this is good to know. You know, you get like a queen here, a bishop here. You're playing for d5. You're playing for, you know, the diagonal if you were white. So it's the structure here, the structural element, and the balance against dynamism, which I think is kind of fascinating in chess, not just with hanging pawns but with isolated pawns. How the possibilities that they afford, but structurally, actually, they're weak, in theory. Now this next move looks a little bit passive, so this starts to give black, I think, the upper hand, knight e1. It's got an idea, of course, you know, maybe the bishop can challenge, you know, the battery, can put more pressure on d5. But now this mysterious move, the bishop had just come from e7, goes back to e7 here, in this particular position. Bishop g3. So what has subtly changed? Well, now knight f8. It's as if Kasparov is actually improving his position, with greater pressure going to be exerted behind d4, because this knight is now coming to e6 to support d4. So knight f3 and now knight e6. Topalov is getting outplayed in the last few moves positionally, it would seem. Bishop h4, and now we see it. We see it here with the knight on e6, and this looks almost optimal now. So d4 is played here. Tactically, with the rook here, there could be some problems on the e file. So e takes, c takes. Right, now what is going on here? It's not the e file, is it? It's this diagonal, which is why knight d4 might be a problem. Let's engine check now this critical position. Why couldn't white have taken on d4? I believe it's just because of g2 actually. Knight takes d4, knight takes, rook takes. Black will be better with bishop takes g2. Yep. If rook takes, whoops, rook takes, queen c2. Now here, black could play bishop c6, for example, or even bishop b7, and he's done the damage on white's king. There's no structural weaknesses here. Mission accomplished. And then he can start maybe playing queen c8 and getting in an attack. So they've done their job here. The idea of d4 would work beautifully if knight takes d4. Okay, Topalov plays knight a4, but we still have a major disaster now, because by playing d4 it's ruptured that e3 pawn, which means f4 is now weak. So the knight comes into f4 with great effect. Now that the rippling effects of that, and the d3 is on the cards, you know, bishop f3, if the bishop is decoyed away from protecting f3, it's starting to look like a disaster, because look what subtly happened. That e3 pawn has been taken out, which was protecting f4. So not only was this knight supporting d4, it's supporting the impact of d4, you know, undermining that e3 pawn to grab that f4 square as an opportunity. So in slow motion, this is beautiful stuff from Kasparov in a rapid play game. So knight f4. So white is now really under severe pressure. One could argue he's probably got a lost position now from the hanging pawns. So knight c5, Kasparov takes on c5, and there's an imminent threat of d3 or knight e2s and d3s. So here, knight e2 or bishop takes f3. It looks all a bit unpleasant. Topalov played bishop takes f6. Alright, let's check this position. Excuse me, we've got to check this position. What is going on here? Is white completely lost here? It looks as though it's minus 4.60. What on earth has happened here? This was minus 0.4 here, and we've gone to minus 4 in this position. Knight a4 wasn't the best. Apparently knight d4 was actually the best move. And now this wasn't the best move. In fact, knight e4 was even technically stronger. With the idea of hitting the bishop on e7. Say takes here. Knight takes d2. So this would be a crushing position. But what has happened here for it to be minus 4 all of a sudden after knight c5? This was a huge blunder apparently. Bishop g3. So knight c5, bishop takes. Now, bishop takes was played in the game, so what if rook takes? Rook takes e2, crushing move. Rook takes e2. So what's happening here? Rook, if takes, bishop f3. If takes, queen takes f3. That's pretty nasty stuff, threatening a mate, pinning the rook. If queen f1, that would be nasty stuff, total disaster. So in the game, Topalov had played bishop takes f6, and there's still a disaster, minus 6 still. This next move might not be optimally the best move, d3. Whoa! In fact, there was 2 knockout blows technically here, really crushing, according to Houdini, the engine Houdini. Bishop b4. So for example, bishop f1, check. Bishop takes f3. If the queen moves, bishop takes d2. If the queen moves here, just taking here. This is like a wreck around white's king. And now this move like king h8 threatens rook g8. So that makes it all the more crushing. The simple move king h8, or even just rook e5 is crushing here. So white's king safety is being shot to pieces as an outcome here. So it seems bishop b4 is a crushing move. What would white do here? If rook takes d4, let's have a look at that. Then knight takes e2. If bishop takes d8, bishop takes d2, and e2 would drop there. So if bishop f1, then the other rook would drop. Now here, bishop takes f3 or knight g2 is crushing. Probably bishop f3 is even more crushing. Bishop takes g2 here. What is going on here, you might ask? Check. Now either take or d3 is strong here. So it's all pretty dire here from this position. In fact, let's turn off the engine. I just wanted to graphically illustrate concretely that white is busted, but this wasn't the optimal move d3. So bishop b4 was even stronger, but bishop takes d3 was played, and now bishop takes f3, and this leaves white just losing material actually now. After rook d5, bishop moves, and now bishop b4 is played, and the bishop can't move without losing. Sorry, the rook can't move without losing the bishop on d3. So rook c3 to try and defend that, losing the exchange, but it really is all over now. Kasparov immediately offers another exchange sack because he'd be winning material if that's taken. So here, Topalov resigned. If takes here, look, he's losing the bishop. So that was total devastation from the hanging pawns. So it's interesting in chess that these structural, seemingly terrible structures with either isolated or hanging pawns can offer so much creativity and dynamism to the pieces behind them in the particular configuration here. So it seems here, what has technically happened if we did a post-mortem of squares and opportunities? What did happen here after d takes b takes? Well, it seems that the b6 square was technically vacated, which means queen b6 to a7 to a8 became technically possible. Otherwise, in this position, black is a bit cramped. Where is the queen going? Can't really go on this diagonal. There's a bishop g3. So one immediate effect was actually just to vacate b6. So that was a key square used by Kasparov, as we saw here, queen b6. Then getting the queen to a8, avoiding the double pawns, means that the queen can no longer be harassed anywhere in particular. And black is ready just to put even more pressure behind d4. So the next stage of this was, he worked out knight fv8 to e6. So how did that become possible here? Well, it seemed to become possible because I don't know actually why, in this position, was like knight e8 impossible because of knight e5 or something. Knight f8 to e8. For some reason, Kasparov waited for the knight to retreat to e1 before carrying out this knight f8 to e6 to support d4. So that's another aspect. So the bishop actually went back to vacate f8 technically. So once f8 was vacated, then f8 to e6, and again d4 is going to be even more powerful. So we have a picture of devastation being built up here. And now maybe, winning a tempo knight e5 or whatever is not effective. There's going to be d4 at all. So knight e5 is out of the question. So white's just waiting for this d4 punch now. I'm not sure he can avoid it. So he plays bishop h4 and it happens. So we see this massive scope of the pieces, on the e file, the knight ready to jump to f4. Everything's like kind of exploding with creativity and possibilities now. So knight f4, lots and lots of possibilities are being generated against white's king and the e file, and even bishop b4s. How did this bishop b4 arrive? When the hanging pawns turned into an isolated pawn here, it meant that b4 was made available to a bishop now. So that's interesting. Earlier, when the hanging pawns were created, b6 was available to the queen, if you remember. But now, when the transition to the isolated pawns, these are the possibilities. So it's these adjacent files, it seems, that the possibilities keep opening up for pieces around the structural weakness. You can say the same about isolated pawns, that it seems to be, lots of opportunities for piece scope being generated around the structural weakness. So knight f4, and here knight c5. So white's game is getting in dire straits. So the crushing move here would have been bishop b4. Now, okay, let's just ask the question: why was this seen by Houdini as not the best move here? What could white have done here? After bishop takes d3, bishop takes f3, g takes, rook d5. Apparently here there was a defensive move available to white, actually, which would leave only -3/3, rook c4. So that's very interesting, that was missed. The disastrous move in this position then was bishop h4, allowing bishop b4. So rook c4 rules out actually bishop b4 and also attacks the knight. So it would have been a key move to play here. So say queen b8, exchange sack, check, winning back the exchange, and it's not as clear what's going on here. So white missed his chance when he played bishop h4, and he was really truly wrecked then in this continuation. So not playing rook c4, he was wrecked after bishop h4. So bishop b4 is really crushing now. Rook c4 loses all of its effect because bishop takes d2 is actually protecting f4 as well. So white's forcibly losing material, and Kasparov is emphasising the d file pin with this rook d8, getting a battery on the d file. Now the queen's coming back very quickly to the centre from its a8 position to win material. So that's pretty vivid, I thought, for the mechanics as well, I hope, of what happened. Why is this concept so powerful of the hanging pawns? But let's look on the other side of the coin now to reflect last night's lecture on the chess-based server, Play Chess. Okay, and it's a classic game. I'm sure you've seen it before, but let's look in particular at the perspective of the hanging pawns. So one moment, please, while I load the PGN for that. Okay, we're going to have a reverse example now, where the hanging pawns were successfully blockaded here in this game. It was Fischer against Spassky in their sixth game in the classic 1972 match, where Fischer surprisingly kicked off with c4, avoiding a lot of the Russian preparation perhaps, who were expecting him to play like 1e4. And he seemed to be aware of the latest theory at the time in the Tartakower variation of the Queen's Gambit declined. So playing white, we have this opening, believe it or not, from Fischer, who had never really played d4 much at all in his career before this match. So knight takes d5, and you think, well, at the moment there's no hanging pawns on the horizon, but actually there's going to be. Knight takes d5, the first pawn is in place with no adjacent pawn on this file, and after rook c1, black is preparing now for c5. So how is Fischer treating the hanging pawns in this game? Well, he gets a very nice pin now, and this is like theory at the time, queen a3. This queen a3 pinning that pawn against the other queen. So we see here big differences in the other game already. Some pieces have already been exchanged off. It looks a little bit more towards the end game almost, with far less pressure being possible for black to ever liberate with d4. In fact, there's such a firm lock in the position against black playing d4, and the bishop's also in the wrong place anyway. If the bishop was on b7 striking down the diagonal, then it would have more meaning. So there's a different meaning altogether of the hanging pawns here, that it might be, if black can wriggle out, maybe later c4 might be useful for general queenside, to generate a passed pawn maybe on the queenside. So it's definitely, it doesn't seem to be about d4 and the diagonal like in the other game. But rook c8, bishop b5. So this is probably an annoying move, because if knight d7, maybe, you know, bishop takes d7 and knight e5 might be the idea. Otherwise it looks a bit strange to play bishop b5. This isn't actually forcing the bishop to move now, this a6, because the pawn is pinned. Okay, so d takes, and now we get the proper hanging pawns. There's no adjacent pawn now to this pawn on that side. There's no adjacent pawn to this pawn on this side. So you would agree that these are hanging pawns now, the c pawn and the d pawn here. So are they like potentially losing trump cards for both sides? They're that dynamic. Depends, you know, can black actually achieve d4 at some point in the future? Here it's just totally locked down because knight takes d4 as a pin. d4 is totally locked down here. Rook a7, unpinning the pawn. Bishop moves back then. Okay, now we see a very interesting sequence of moves. Knight d4. Fischer plays a seemingly flash move using the pin now on the c5 pawn. He plays knight d4, and he's almost going to do something completely and utterly outrageous, which is this. We assume that the point structurally of the weakness, same with an isolated pawn, is to exploit the weakness as is, but actually sometimes you need to almost repair the weakness to create something even more exploitable. And you know, in games of isolated pawns, sometimes Kasparov has lost to Karpov when Karpov has exploited an isolated pawn by actually giving it a neighbouring pawn and then exploiting e6. Sometimes this huge paradox happens to create the more exploitable weakness, to get away from the theoretical structural weakness. And here, that's the whole point of knight d4, that the hanging pawns are outrageously going to be repaired by Fischer now, with knight takes e6. We're no longer labelling this technically as hanging pawns. These seem to be pawns that may be underminable at d5 in this particular moment of time, because black hasn't got much control of the d5 square. The hanging pawns have gone. There's an adjacent pawn. There's also dynamism potentially on the f file, which doesn't count for much here, it would seem, because there's not much other pressure apart from the queen on f8. And without the dark square bishop, there's less chance of being hacked with a dark square disaster. So they've been dissolved here. So why on earth would Fischer dissolve the hanging pawns? So they only existed for actually a moment in this game. If we rewind here, for a little moment in time, after d takes, b takes, here at move 15 they existed, and they just disappeared quite quickly after knight e6 at move 19. Only 3 moves they existed for. But it's d5 now which represents an exploitable weakness. e4 is played as a temporary positional sacrifice, emphasising black's lack of control of d5, and that these pawns can be locked down now, and white has the advantage of the light square bishop to roam around the light squares. So this next move looks utterly passive from Boris Spassky. d4, his game here, you could argue, is strategically lost after this move d4, because this bishop is very, very powerful. It's going to really show great superiority to the knight, especially if the knight's not given the e5 square. So immediately Fischer clamps down on e5, and now Fischer gets to work on putting more and more pressure now on the light squares. So as far as the hanging pawns is concerned, they only existed for a fleeting moment in this game to create a really much more exploitable weakness. Black is restrained, and you've got a superior piece here, bishop knight, and white has the potential use of the f file as well as locking down black's remaining counterplay. He's going to play a4 pretty soon as well, some waiting moves happen here before the time control. But now he's transforming his advantages now of this superior bishop and the use of the f-file and this big pawn on e6 into a vicious kingside attack. He does a very simple and effective battery coming up now with queen and bishop against h7, simply threatening rook f8 now, mating on h7, you know, takes, queen h7 mate. So prompting a very favourable positional sacrifice now. Knight f6, very, very favourable, immediately getting a pawn for the exchange, but also h6 is dropping off at leisure, it would seem. But first, bishop c4 was played. It looks absolutely hopeless. King h8, queen f4, winning another pawn. Spassky just resigned here. Let's just engine check this game if you think there might be some hope here to, say, protect the pawn. Say rook h7, there's rook f8 winning. If king here, let's just play it, check, queen g3. Now this e7 would rear its head for a discovered attack, like mating, in fact, very, very quickly. So it's totally hopeless. Black's king safety is being shot to pieces. So it seems another side effect also, technically, actually, if we rewind, when the isolated pawns were removed from black with this knight takes e6, another side effect was actually weakening black's king position. The weaknesses of the light squares are evident already here because of this f takes. It's removing some of black's king safety. So just the mechanics of this game. Let's do a mechanics post-mortem of what happened here. So the hanging pawns only existed for a fleeting moment in this game example, and they were made into a truly more significantly exploitable weakness because of Fischer's knight d4 takes e6. He removed immediately the hanging pawns. But so much for black's dynamism with d4, like in the other game. You couldn't get two games contrasting so strongly, I think, with the same structure, the pros and cons. So I thought it's interesting to put both games in this very same video. So they were really locked down, with the bishop being far superior to the knight, and now, you know, white's really going on the rampage on the king side with the f-file, and that bishop is just very, very dangerous, supporting that very, very dangerous pawn. The e6 affords queen e5 lots of dangerous pins, queen f7 support. But now actually the final phase was this battery with bishop and queen on the diagonal. Not too subtle, going for the mate on h7. So the damage had been done with knight e6 earlier, because, you know, g6, why is that so weak? You know, this is not usually the case, but it is here. That black's king was already shot to pieces a bit from earlier. Okay, so Spassky had resigned here. I hope you enjoyed both game examples and it got you thinking about the properties of hanging pawns. So we have two very different examples. So in this game, the hanging pawns occurred for just a moment in this position. So after d takes, b takes, we had hanging pawns. And in the other game, it was interesting as well how Kasparov really did prepare the punch d4 as black. Okay, comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.